Hi everybody, this is Hustle Hub. I'm Giacomo, and today I'm with Patrick Flood. He's a CFA charter holder. He runs Latam Stocks, so he talks about stocks in Latin America. He runs a Substack newsletter, Latam Stocks, and you can also find him on YouTube on his YouTube channel. So Patrick, please introduce yourself, and then we'll get into the content of today.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and present. So, like you mentioned, I run Latam Stocks, which is an equity-focused newsletter, and then I also have a podcast, the Latam Stocks podcast. The podcast is more asset class agnostic, so I'll talk to debt investors, economists, CFOs, as long as it's focused on Latin America. I'm happy to talk to them. And then my background, very quickly, is I spent over 10 years now covering Latin America. I did a year of my undergraduate degree in Brazil and kind of never left. So I've been living and working based out of Brazil for over 10 years now, always working with financial markets. So I did asset management, investment banking. I worked at a cryptocurrency exchange, but my passion, I love covering equity. So my focus now is the newsletter, which is equity focused, and then the podcast. So today I'm going to present a recent write-up for a Brazilian company that I covered called Afya. Slide, there we go, click. So yeah, before we get into it, just a brief overview of Afya. They're the largest medical education company in Brazil based on the number of private seats. So Brazil has about 42,000 medical school seats. It's highly regulated. So 10,000 of them are public schools. So government run, they're free for the most part. And then the remaining 32,000 seats are private. Afya represents about 10% of all the private seats. So roughly 3,200 seats. 32 campuses spread across 19 Brazilian states. One of the reasons I like to cover this because it's listed in the United States. So it's a NASDAQ listed company, AFYA is the ticker. So most people listening to this should be able to access the stock if it interests them. Yeah, so like I said, they're a medical education company, and then they also have a health tech segment, which we'll get into later. Current price is around $20, and it's about a 1.8 to 1.9 billion US dollar market cap company. So here's the overview, what we're going to talk about. Before we get into Afya and their business and financials, I'm going to give a brief overview of medical school and the medical industry in Brazil. So you have a base and understand kind of what segment Afya is operating in. We'll stop for questions and I'll talk to Giacomo after each of these. Then we'll go over Afya's business and their strategy. And at the end, we'll get into their financials and a little bit about the valuation. So let's do it. So medical school in Brazil. So the typical career path for a medical student is 6 years as an undergraduate program. So they go right into med school out of high school. They'll take entrance exams. There'll be a public test if you want to go towards the public schools. And then a lot of the private schools like Afya will have their own entrance exam that students will take. So they might take 3 or 4, which is different than maybe Americans who everybody takes the SAT and it applies to all kinds of schools. In Brazil, it's a little different. So after the 6 years of undergrad, they're certified doctors. So the student can then practice as a general practitioner, a generalist physician. The most common path, though, is for them to continue their education. So they'll usually go into a residency program, which is the most common path. But there's also other certification pathways that aren't necessarily a residency. So after the 6 years of undergrad, they can take certifications, they can do a residency, they can do 2 residencies, and it usually takes about 4 to 10 years for the specialization after. So we're talking about, a typical Afya student might be with them for, 6 years at a minimum at the undergrad, but most are with them closer to 10 years or more. So this is what the path looks like. So you got the medical student, there's the undergrad for 6 years. Then they can either go to residency, and their first residency might be 2 to 3 years, in which case now they're a specialist. The example they give is cardiologist. But if they want to then do another specialization, could be another residency for 2 to 3 more years. And then they're a cardiac surgeon in addition to just being a cardiologist. Alternatively, they have this path that's also, 4 to 6 more years where it's exams rather than residency. But residency is the most common path for a postgrad. So a little bit more about medical school. It's extremely competitive in Brazil. There's over 5 applicants, about 5.2 for every seat. So that means about 200,000 students are competing for the 42,000 seats. My understanding is the public seats tend to be the most competitive because they're free. So obviously, those are where the best ranking students will try and go. Highly employable. So there's not really any unemployed doctors in Brazil. And they make significantly higher wages. So compared to, say, a lawyer or an engineer, I mean, a doctor in Brazil on average makes more than 3 times what a lawyer might make, which is, a significant difference, and it helps explain some of the competitiveness. So here's employability, also 97% employability. Compare that to lawyer and engineer, same thing. It's consistently been this competitive. So if you look at the applicants, it hasn't really fallen off even through the COVID and everything. It's been, about 5, a little over 5 applicants per medical school seat. And this here shows the demand for residency. So it shows that even at the postgrad level, there's about 17,000 residency seats and there's almost 30,000 students. So it's a little less competitive than 5 to 1, but it's still, there's more demand for the residency seats than there are seats. So a lot of people will then say, oh, well, of course they make a lot of money. There's not enough doctors in Brazil, so a lot of demand, but that's not necessarily the case in my experience. Healthcare in Brazil at the high end is extremely good. Holistic, I like to tell people when to explain this is, you look at emerging countries, and a lot of times you'll see, like the Mayo Clinic in the US, one of the best hospitals in the world. You'll see, Saudi princes or African leaders, they'll go there for their healthcare. In Brazil, they go to Einstein on Avenida Paulista in Sao Paulo. So the elite here use the healthcare here because it's very good. I have friends that are doctors. They're extremely competent. I trust them. I'm very happy with my healthcare here. So it's a doctor density problem rather than a doctor shortage. So I'll show the chart in the next slide, but cities with over 500,000 people in Brazil have 5.3 doctors per 1,000 residents, which compared to, say, the US, UK, or Spain, which are around 2.5, gives you an idea. Like in Sao Paulo, there's more doctors per 1,000 people than the United States, almost double. But the reason the ratio ends up being slower and people associate, poor healthcare with Brazil is when you start to get to cities of less than 50,000 in population. There's very few doctors. So it's a regional thing too. I'll show the 2 slides. So cities with over 500,000 people, 5.3 doctors per 1,000 people. That accounts for 32% of the population. Then 100,000 residents to 500,000 is 2.5, which is pretty much on par with the US, the UK, Spain, or the three comparable countries I pulled up. So that's like 32 and 26, 50, 58% of Brazil roughly has access to doctors at the same percentage, the same doctors per resident as the US or the UK or Spain. But then once you get below 100,000 residents, it starts to fall off. And then, look, small cities in Brazil, there's almost no healthcare, right? So it's a huge divergence. And then the trend also holds regionally. So if you look here, this is Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, which is a mining and agriculture region. Rio de Janeiro, 3.4 doctors per resident, so a high ratio. The South, 2.95, and then the Midwest, which is, the most important maybe agriculture region in the world, also has great healthcare, plenty of access to doctors. When you get to the 2 poorest regions of Brazil, the North and the Northeast, we're looking at, 1.4, 1 point, can't see what the thing, but much lower. So the trend also holds regionally. So that's a quick overview of the medical industry and the medical school. So what do you think, Giacomo?
Yeah,
anything unclear?
No, I think it's pretty clear. So yeah, just getting to know the dynamics in a country. Yeah, it's also interesting to see how the 2 things work with each other, the public and the private, and whether the public can sustain the workload, or if it's all up to the private to make up for that.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that the number of seats is regulated. So I don't think Afya can just double the number of medical school seats. I think the government approves a certain growth percentage. So their growth in the number of students is regulated, not necessarily capped. I suppose the Brazilian government can double the amount they permit next year if they want to, but Afya can't just double the number of medical school seats. I might not, that's my understanding. I mean, check me on that, but That's my understanding. So we'll get into their strategy in the next section, and there's a reason. It helps explain their strategy to understand that dynamic. That the public sector is what determines the growth in the number of seats.
Okay. Okay,
So
we can to the
go.
next.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about Afya and their business. So, like I said, here's the number of approved seats, public, private. We talked about that at the very beginning. Afya's market share is about 10% of the private seats, which is nearly double the next biggest competitors. And then 76% are smaller schools that don't even come in the top 5. So that's the dynamic. It's very scattered. Translate it's pulverized market is the word that comes to mind. I translated from Portuguese, but it means it's a lot of small players, and it's not a very consolidated market. So they have 30 campuses spread across Brazil, most of the states. Interestingly enough, in the north and northeast, where there's not enough doctors, the government's launched some programs to try and incentivize doctors to go to the regions where there's not enough doctors. So I think that might play a part in where the seats get approved. So I don't know if they might be able to get seats approved in the north and northeast, and then they're trying to incentivize students to leave Sao Paulo and Rio and the wealthier areas of the south and go be doctors elsewhere in the country. So their growth strategy has been via acquisition. They've been extremely aggressive since August of 2019. They've acquired 20 companies, and their growth strategy, the acquisitions, 2 categories, which pretty much shows their strategy for growth. So they've been consolidating the undergraduate medical school business, right? If they can't grow the number of seats because it's regulated the way they want to, then they're going to go out and buy smaller players, which they've done. And they want to continue to dominate this market. It's their core business is the undergraduate medical schools. And then the other segment is the digital segment, which is a diversification strategy. So since they can't grow necessarily at the speed they want to in terms of number of seats in their core business, they can consolidate the market, but they also need to look for other revenue sources. So they've been trying to go up and down the value chain, and they've done that through a health tech division. So it's almost a venture capital portfolio of health-related tech companies in Brazil. So here is their timeline for M&A. It shows all of them since 2019, and you'll notice, it's either a medical school or a health tech, all of them. So health tech, medical school, and we'll talk about it later, but Afya stock's about 8.5 times EBITDA right now. So if you notice while we're here, you can stop and notice that they're acquiring almost all of these schools that they're consolidating at a lower multiple than they trade. So they almost get a rewrite as soon as they buy them. This one, 4.5, almost double, right? And then the health tech, I'll highlight a few of the companies they've acquired in a few slides, but it's kind of scattered. There's not really, it's like a venture capital portfolio. So it's not focused on one specific niche in the value chain. They have websites that do information. They have telemedicine. They have, pharmacy type startups and tech companies. So yeah, here's a few of them that I'll highlight. Physicians Marketplace. It connects doctors and patients for scheduling. So as of year end December 2022, they had 23,000 users, almost 21 million medical consultations that year, 115,000 consultations via telemedicine, and the platform had 6 million electronic medical prescriptions issued. A different one is just a website, Portal PebMed. It's just like, what's the one in the US? WebMD. It's like WebMD in Portuguese, kind of. It's free content, opinion papers, I broke my arm, what should I do, kind of stuff. And it's a pretty popular website, right? 1.3 million monthly active users and 200,000 monthly active users on the Whitebook platform, 1.3 on the platform in total. And then Click Pharma. So it's tracks prescription drug prices, cosmetics, personal hygiene, anything you can get at a pharmacy, basically a CVS or Rite Aid. They're tracking the prices because Brazilian consumers tend to be much more price sensitive, especially for prescription medications, expensive stuff that might be an unforeseen cost. They can search through from 5,600 pharmacies in Brazil are connected to the platform, and then they can buy through the platform, I believe. But the Click Pharma, Afya is monetizing via ads. So it's a pretty standard blog model in most, but 21.2 million visitors in 2022. So also a widely used platform. The only other thing I'll note here is that, what did I want to note here? 50,000 users. Yeah, so you'll know, we'll get into it when we get into financials actually. So let's pause here. And then I guess if you have any questions about.
Yeah. I have a few questions regarding, you talked about the government doesn't always allow Afya to open new schools, right? So they have to go through basically a
Yeah,
process to be accepted, right?
it's not that they can't open new schools. It's that they have a certain allotment of seats. So
Okay.
they could open new schools, but if they didn't get any new seat allotment, I believe that then they would just have to, reduce the size of an existing school.
Okay. Because yeah, what this thing right here made me think, is there something like a problem with the government fears a company having a monopolistic approach, a dominant position? Because you've talked about, especially in the lower income parts of Brazil, they have a hard time having access to medical services. But at the same time, if they if they limit the number of doctors that can go through medical school, it's hard to come up with the supply of doctors, basically. So is there something like a problem with regulation?
I'm not sure what their logic is for not growing it, honestly, because if there's 5 medical students applying every year, it would seem that they can, double it, make it 2.5 medical students applying, and they could grow the number of
And they
doctors
would
pretty
solve
quickly.
and they would solve probably a lot of problems in the poorest parts of Brazil, right?
I'm sure. Well, so if there's any monopolistic player right now in the industry, it's the government, right? Because about 25% of the seats are theirs. So I don't know if it comes down to a cost control for them, because right, for 10,000 out of the 42,000 med students, they're paying. So I'm not sure why they don't, honestly. It doesn't make sense to me either, but it's what it is. So I'm not sure what the logic is for not simply doubling or letting the private sector double the amount of medical school seats.
Yeah, because if that's the fear, but if Afya keeps expanding, maybe in the future we'll have a harder time buying new players if they get a bigger share of the market. Is it possible that the government doesn't want a company to be a dominant player in this field specifically?
It could be. I mean, if they wanted to stop the consolidation too, right? They have a regulator, CADE, CADE. So at any point, if they wanted to stop Afya's growth in the undergrad segment, they can just stop approving their acquisitions. So I think they can still control that if they wanted to, but I'm not sure if it's that they don't want it to grow, or I don't know the logic, honestly.
Okay.
It's kind of hard to understand too, but I put that in the risks when we get to the end, is that it's highly regulated and the regulation doesn't necessarily make sense. So it's
Okay.
definitely a risk for the company, is the highly regulated nature of the medical industry in Brazil.
Okay. And another question that I have, given that you've talked about the government trying to incentivize doctors to go to the poorest parts of Brazil, does Afya have a different pricing based on their geography? I guess they can charge more in Sao Paulo or Rio compared to Manaus, for example.
Yeah, I think it depends on the school. So their average ticket size is about 7,000 reais a month, which is, 1,500 US dollars roughly. The exchange rate's 5 to 1.
Okay.
And if you break it down, they have schools that go 4,000 reais a month at the lower end, and then it gets up to 10, 11,000 reais at the higher end, which is very expensive in Brazil. So it spreads. So I think it's based on the service, the prestige of the school, the location for sure. So if it's an old building with crappy computers and old desks, I'm sure it's a cheaper one. And then the newest high-tech schools in Sao Paulo are probably at the high end.
Okay.
But their schools in the portfolio, they're the range. So they're at the lower end, the middle end, and the high end.
Okay.
So this is just how they envision their business. It's a little confusing of an infographic, but I put it up here for viewers to look at while we did questions, and they view themselves as a hub. The other thing, I remember what I wanted to mention when we talked about the digital services business. It's really interesting as a value add because they have this potential to create sticky users, right? So you're an 18-year-old kid, you start medical school, and Afya schools start training you on their tech. So their telemedicine tech, and you know, it is, you're probably more likely to stick with if it works for you. You've been using it for 6 years in college. So they have a unique position that allows them to benefit. There's synergies with their health tech platform that other players in the med school industry might not have. So should we do the financials?
Yeah.
Okay, so for the first 9 months of 2023, they had 2.1 billion reais in revenue. Like I said earlier, the exchange rate's about 5-1, so that's about $400 million in revenue. It's up from 1.7 billion the previous year. A lot of the growth is via acquisition, obviously, so acquisitions did have an impact. Gross margins around 62%, down slightly from the previous year, but on par. It's a profitable company, so they had net income of 303 million reais, about 60 million USD for the first 9 months of 2023 at a 14% margin. Net margin did come down significantly year over year. Financing costs are a big expense in Brazil. Interest rates, even though there have been cuts, are still at about 11.25%. So debt is expensive. The liquidity is fine in the short term. The current ratio is 1.2. Balance sheet's leveraged, but not overly so, with a debt to equity also of 1.2. And then the only other thing I noted in my write-up for readers about the balance sheet is there's a ton of goodwill from acquisitions. So leverage is much higher if you base it on tangible assets. There's a huge, it's the largest asset account, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're actually looking for liquidity ratios and the actual leverage, if you back out goodwill, then it's much more leverage than 1.2. Here's the debt burden, why it's important. So 2.6 billion reais in debt. It's about 500 million USD. The duration's 2.2 years. So very relevant because, you know, at 400 million in net income, they're not going to pay back, you know, 2 billion in the next 2 years. So they're going to have to finance or refinance at some point, which is a risk. Duration 2.2. And like I said, interest expense is quite high in Brazil. So their average interest rate is 11.5% on the debt. So that explains a lot of variability in net income. Other thing that's interesting to note here is their largest financer is SoftBank, who's mostly associated with startup and tech companies, which is, you know, they're helping them finance some of the tech acquisitions, I'm sure, which explains a lot of this. Ownership structure. So the shares are actually pretty tightly held. 47% is owned by Bertelsmann, which I hadn't heard of till I did this write-up, but it's a private German multinational conglomerate, big company. So it's a big player. Then 18% is owned by the Estevez family. 4.5% by officers in the company's treasury. So there's relevant insider ownership, and about 30% of the shares free float. So fairly tightly held. Valuation, dividends, and buybacks. No dividend. There's a modest buyback program. Over the last 7 quarters, they bought back about 2.5% of the outstanding shares. And the valuation is rich, in my opinion. So price to book at 2.7, price to sales 3.5, price to EBITDA 8.5, and then price to net income, price to earnings is 24.5x. So investors are paying quite the premium to own the market leader. You know, some of the smaller undergrad schools they're buying are trading at, you know, 4 or 5 times EBITDA. So they're paying a premium to own the dominant player for sure. And I'm sure there's some optionality value built in for the digital tech platform, the health tech. And then for those that like the chart, here's the technicals. So IPO'd in 2019, you got COVID and everything. It actually did pretty well, and then broke down. You can see here a clear level of supply and demand around $17 a share, clear bottoming pattern, and it broke out towards the end of 2023. And now it's sitting, you know, right around its moving averages that I don't show on the chart. But yeah, it's not clear which way it's going to break on the technicals. But to me, I'm not a technical analyst. I did part of the CMT program. So I look at charts as a visualization tool, and it's not clear, you know, what's going to happen next. It could easily retest and come back down to 17, which would be about a 15% drop from here. But it could also, you could easily see a continuation to new all-time highs. I think it tilts bullish, but I don't trade off the charts or anything. So just there for those that are interested. And then here's just some summaries and conclusions. I always put these at the end of the write-ups, just a couple positives and a couple negatives to think about while investors do their own analysis. So their financials are decent, right? They're a profitable company, even with the high cost of debt. Liquidity's okay in the short term, but like I mentioned on the debt slide, 2.2 years is the average term. So it's going to be difficult to finance and pay that back from cash flows. So they'll have to refinance the debt, roll it over, or issue shares, maybe sell off a business. I don't know, but they'll have to raise capital somehow unless they can up their cash flow. So the core business is still a growth business, although regulated. So the number of medical school seats in Brazil does grow, just not at the rate that maybe Afya would like to, which explains why they're consolidating the industry. Uniquely positioned as the largest private player in Brazil. So like I mentioned, the digital services are highly complementary. You can create sticky users. They can, if you're a health tech startup in Brazil, they're probably your dream exit, right? You want to get acquired by them if you want to get acquired. And then this is interesting. I noted this, and I don't see anyone talking about this at all, but there's recently an election in Argentina, and Milei has vowed to, I don't know if he's made it official yet, but he will, cancel free education for foreigners. So it was very common for Brazilians that didn't necessarily get into the medical school they wanted to, or only got into an expensive one, or they couldn't afford private and didn't get into public. They'd go to Argentina and do medical school for free, and then they'd come back and live in Brazil and practice. There's no requirement for them to stay in Argentina. Argentinians hated it every time you would bring it up to them. I talked to a few friends and say it's ridiculous. They don't even stay and practice as doctors for a year. They just go immediately back to Brazil. So with this over, there's about 18,000 Brazilian students across all disciplines, not just medical school, from Argentina that could be returning to Brazil if Milei cancels it. And apparently a lot of these students, I didn't know this, are there without even visas. So Argentina didn't even really they never enforced their tourist visa policy. So a lot of them would just go and stay for 6-7 years, do free medical school, not be regular or legal in the country. So yeah, there's the potential for some of them to actually get deported. So it's not just like, oh, they'll decide to come back. Maybe they stay in Argentina. Some of them might actually be getting deported from Argentina. And 18,000 might not sound like a lot, but considering that Afya only has 3,200 seats, if there's an increase of, say, I don't know, 1,000 more students coming back, that's significant demand. So I don't know if that results in higher prices in the ticket price. I'm not sure what that means for Afya, but more potential medical school students is clearly a good thing for them. I'm just not sure how it affects their financials or strategy, but it's something to pay attention to in the short term because it's a potential catalyst for sure. If you see competitiveness or ticket price increase, it's good for Afya. And then the negatives, they have significant debt, right? Like I mentioned, it's expensive. It's maturing in about 2 years. Like I mentioned, we talked a lot about the regulation in Brazil. It's highly regulated. So there's relevant political risk. There could be a change to the rules that could negatively impact Afya. They could start having their acquisitions denied. They could be capped at the number of seats. There could be no more growth. It's quite complex to unpack their acquisitions. There's a lot of them. The medical schools are a little more simple, but to start trying to put a valuation on a portfolio of startup companies is a little bit more difficult. So I find it difficult, especially with the high goodwill. And then the valuation looks expensive at 25x earnings. It's trading at a premium for sure.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's where you can find me. I had a slide in here, forgot it. The only other thing I'll mention about the financials, I guess the slide got deleted, but the undergrad medical school segment is about 87% of revenue. So digital services is 7%, and then the remaining 5%, they put continuing education as its own segment. Continuing education is just a very low incremental cost addition to the undergrad, the core business, right? They already have the schools, they're paying rent, they have the teachers. It doesn't cost them very much more to offer a specialization course to post-grad students. But yeah, so that's how it breaks down, but it's very heavily weighted in undergrad education. So the first 6 years is where they make their money.
Okay. So yeah, it doesn't look very cheap, but I guess people are paying for the moat that it has in this business, except for the government, of course, that has a important role in medical school in Brazil. So yeah, what I don't know if you want to talk about this, but a year ago, people, especially in the markets, were very scared of what the Lula return would have meant for uh, ease of doing business in Brazil and so on. So, what are, from my understanding, yeah, Lula sometimes makes his statements, and his ministers correct them and make them sound less scary to the business community. But what is the sentiment over there? And are there any regulations that could either facilitate or put in a more difficult position, in this case, Afya, with its debt, because the risk that a country has is reflected in the cost of debt. And in this case, it's pretty important.
So yeah, a couple points. So related to the cost of debt, Brazil recently had central bank independence. It's been one of the best performing central banks in the world. It's maintained its independence for now. They've gone after it. He's done his best to trash the guy, Campos Neto, publicly. He wants to take over the central bank and do what he wants with it, but hasn't been able to. They're in a cutting cycle. So the cost of debt is coming down. It was over 13 at the beginning, at the peak, and they've cut for 2 or 3 meetings now, about July of last year, roughly. Q2, Q3 last year, they started cutting, and it's down to 11.25. The next meeting, very likely they'll cut again, probably another half point. So the cost of debt should come down independent of the political scenario, assuming you don't see some huge headline about the central bank president leaving or anything. So the cost of debt should continue to decline, although it'll still remain high. Even after the cutting cycle, most people are projecting terminal rates in Brazil to be about 8 or 9%. So it still won't be cheap debt, but it'll be cheaper. Related to general sentiment. So look, it's an anti-business regime. There's no other way about it. It's not pro-business. I wouldn't expect at all a positive surprise on the regulatory front. General sentiment is pretty bad. So over the weekend, Brazil had its largest protests since about 2016 that I can remember, when Dilma got impeached. So the business community is not particularly happy. They've come in pedal to the metal. Interest expenses up compared to last year. They're spending. It's a spendthrift government. They spend money. So the economic situation here is complex. So it's a difficult scenario. I don't see much talk about the medical industry, honestly. I don't know if there's plans to regulate, deregulate, or anything, but if there were changes, it would probably be more to the healthcare system than the health education system, which obviously would impact the health education. But Brazil has kind of this parallel system where there's plenty of private healthcare, but there is also free healthcare. There's government healthcare. SUS is the system. So yeah, I haven't seen any major proposals for that, but it doesn't mean they can't come in and do something crazy and unexpected. But if I were, in terms of Afya's business, the political risk, I would be expecting a negative surprise, not a positive surprise, if there's a surprise.
Okay.
And then was there another part to the question at the beginning? I forgot. There was debt. There was political sentiment.
It was regarding the political situation and how that could influence the debt situation of Afya. And are they already in talks, from your understanding, are they already in talks for, renegotiating the debt or changing the schedule of the servicing of that debt? Because
I haven't seen anything. And the way it works for other companies I've owned that have similar situations is that they don't tend to disclose to the market until they have an announcement that they're going to offer a new debt. So there's another company I follow that had the same exact thing happen. And I was like, okay, when are they going to do this? Right? They're about to go bankrupt within a year. And there's an announcement, we're going to raise 700 million reais at this interest rate, and we're going to offer it to the market next month. And then, okay, so they're going to try and do it. And then you don't know if they'll get the full 700 million or if they'll get 400, you don't know what demand's going to be. But they announced that they hired so-and-so investment bank to offer this much debt. So I haven't seen anything to offer yet. I think 2.5 years is a long time for most market participants. So I don't think they necessarily need to do that yet. I think they can afford to wait for terminal rates to come down, so that when they do refinance, it's at a 8 or 9% plus instead of an 11.5 or 11. So I think they can afford to wait, a couple more quarters before they need to make that announcement.
Okay. And did SoftBank say anything regarding this company? Because SoftBank had a hard time a few years ago with WeWork and other investments that it made. But is it really invested in the company? Is it, from your understanding, is it willing to put more resources in the company, or they'll have to go
I'm not
away?
I'm not sure what if they own equity or not. So the only thing I came across SoftBank is that they're a lender. So they lent the company money. I'm not sure if the notes are convertible. I didn't pull up. I didn't think that deep. But yeah, so I don't think they're an equity holder. I think, to my understanding, they're only a debt holder. And whether or not they'll, loan them another 100 or 200 million, maybe. I mean, probably depends on SoftBank's situation. I'll leave that question up to a SoftBank analyst, someone that knows their balance sheet better than I do.
Okay, that makes
But
sense.
it fits with them though, right? It's a health tech platform, so whether or not they, who knows if they have a health tech investment that they want to get acquired by Afya, maybe they lend the money to Afya to buy their own company. I don't know, but yeah, I wouldn't rule it out because the company seems to fit with SoftBank's MO.
Okay. But yeah, probably the ratios that it has are given by the strength that it has in this market, the strong presence that it has. And yeah, it will probably depend a lot based on the government, and given the demand that there is for a medical school, it's probably dependent on the government to allow them to accept new students, right?
Yeah. So I think you're right that they have a pretty significant moat, right? Like even if demand for medical school in Brazil drops by 50%, they're probably still going to fill all their seats. There's 5-1. So I think top line revenue is pretty secure. And then the market's clearly already anticipated, and discounted decreased financing expenses, so increase in earnings. But moving forward, once I think that's already priced in, it looks pretty rich. So moving forward, the growth is slow and steady. They'll have the seats filled. I don't see a reason to believe they're not going to be profitable. So they'll have some type of earnings, but investors are certainly paying a premium for it. That's for sure.
Okay. So I'm done with the questions. Patrick, if you want to add anything else, feel free to do so. If not, I really want to thank you for taking the time and sharing your analysis with us.
Yeah, no, I'll just send everyone off. So if you want to read the full write-up, it's on Substack, latamstocks.substack.com. You can find me on Twitter at Latam Stocks. The podcast is at Latam Stocks on YouTube, or connect with me on LinkedIn, Patrick Flood. You'll find me there. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, connect with anyone, discuss. Everything is free too. The Substack's completely free. I don't charge for it. So.
Okay. So good to know. So Patrick, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. This is it for today. I'm Giacomo. This is Hub. See you next time.